The app helps me so much to understand my body so I can make better decisions to reach my goals and look amazing on my wedding day. So if you want to take the next step to a fitter, healthier version of you, go to lumen.me/Kimber or just click the link below and you'll get 15% off your Lumen. And thank you so much to Lumen for sponsoring today's video. I really want to get into today's case because I want you to pay close attention to the facts in this case. It's one that kind of kept me up at night thinking about the discrepancies, thinking about theories, thinking about what really happened. And that is enough to make my head spin. So I want to get your opinions because you're all so smart, you're insightful. I read all your comments, even if I don't reply. And I feel like a lot of you can be actual detectives in real life. So I like to get your perspective. But you really have to pay attention because there's a lot going on in this case. It is solved, but I just think it's interesting. And when you start to hear all the things I'm going to tell you about, I think you're going to understand what I mean. So let me take you back to that roadside in the middle of the night on April 5th of 1991. A detective, Sergeant Dan Nichols of the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, arrived on the scene shortly after 3 a.m. The location was Riverview Drive, in front of the water treatment plant about a mile from the Chain of Rocks Bridge. The young man that flagged down that semi-truck was 19-year-old Thomas Cummins. He was a firefighter with the Montgomery County Fire and Rescue in Maryland. Now, Tom's story came out in fragments at first. He was urgent. His words were coming out faster than he could organize them. And he started from the beginning because detectives were like, slow down. What is going on? He said that him and his family, his mother Kay and his father Gene, and his two sisters, 16-year-old Janine and 15-year-old Kathy, were celebrating spring break with a family trip to see their cousins, 20-year-old Julie, 19-year-old Robin, and 9-year-old Jamie. The Cummins family is from Washington, D.C., and they were staying with their grandpa on Fair Acres Road, which was about 10 minutes away. His father's sister, Virginia, known as Ginny, was his cousin's mom, and she also lived about 10 minutes away off Petite Drive. So now the detectives had the basics. The family was visiting together for spring break. Got it. Tom explained that night, before they were enjoying one of the last nights together before their long drive back to Washington the next day, he didn't want the night to end. And his older cousins, Julie and Robin, wanted him to come out and get some coffee and hang out at Denny's. Denny's, it used to be open like 24 hours a day. This was the 90s. I remember going to Denny's. So he asked his dad if he could go, but he said no. He said, we have way too much to do to prepare for the early drive the next morning. But Tom, he's 19. He's a little rebellious teen. And he really saw no harm in hanging out with his own cousins. So at least he convinced his dad to let him sleep out in the van instead of the house. But what he had in mind was to wait for Julie to drive over with Robin and pick him up and then go to Denny's. So she pulled up in her Chevy Chevette around 11 p.m. But now that they had the whole night to hang out, since he's no longer asking for permission, he's asking for forgiveness if he gets caught, the three of them decided on a totally different plan. They wanted to visit the Chain of Rocks Bridge. And this was a place that the girls loved, a place where they actually painted a huge poem on the concrete. It was about unity. It said, united we stand, divided we fall. It's not a black or white thing. We're in a new generation and we take a stand. So they drove over to the bridge, to the parking lot. They got out and they proceeded to go and see it on the bridge. It was just supposed to be a quick midnight trip. Nothing unusual. That is until Tom said they were attacked. He said while they were out on the bridge in the darkness, a group of men who seemed friendly at first came up and started talking to them. One of them even smoked a cigarette with them. Another one actually showed them how you can climb through a manhole. I'm going to explain this in a minute. Inside the bridge on the deck. And another one called out saying he lost his flashlight. So if they saw it, let him know. And then they left and they were heading in the opposite direction. But at some point, they come back. And that's when everything changed. Tom explained that the men surrounded them. One of them grabbed him and they said, this is a robbery. And they forced him to the ground. And they said, don't look up or I will kill you. Then they took Julie and Robin. And at this point, Tom is telling the story and he's frantic. He can hardly speak. His voice keeps cracking. And he was sobbing as he described hearing the screams from his cousins and the entire struggle they went through. They were being attacked. He said that he heard his cousins begging and crying as these men were forcing themselves on them one by one. And Tom was just laying on the bridge. He felt helpless. He was listening and he couldn't do anything. And then at one point, one of the men came back over, took his wallet, and then he opens it and sees a badge. It was his firefighter badge, but they accused him of being a cop. And their threats got even worse. They told him, "We know where you live," because they saw his ID. And they said, "If you tell anyone what we're doing, if you tell anyone anything, we'll come after you." Tom told the police that eventually these men forced him down a manhole on the bridge, and there was a steel platform suspended really high above the river, right under the road. And when he got down there, he saw Julie and Robin. They were not clothed, and they were terrified. And he joined them, and he was trying to comfort them. He was trying to hold on to them, and they were crowded on this narrow part of a ledge under the bridge about 60 feet above the dark water. And then came the moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life. This is what happened. What he was talking about. Not only were his cousins attacked and begging, but out of nowhere, one of these men reached out and they pushed Julie off of the platform. Her body disappeared into the darkness, and then before he could do anything, his other cousin Robin was pushed. And then he could hear their screams just vanishing as they fell into the river. And this river was moving very fast. And that's when they turned to Tom and they told him, "Jump or get shot." And he jumped. He hit the water really hard and the current pulled him under. And when he surfaced, he saw Julie. He said he saw her for a moment. That's when she grabbed onto him, but then they sank down together. But Tom was able to kick free and he rose up again to the surface. But that's when he realized that Julie was gone. And now he was alone. He was in shock and he was freezing, but he just kept swimming towards the shore. He pulled himself up the riverbank and then he found the building and he stumbled towards the road and he was desperate for help flagging down a truck. Now, as Tom was recounting this horrific night, detectives began to question everything he was saying. You know, they're kind of skeptical at this point. They're like, okay, because we'll get there why they were a little bit skeptical. But his fingers were pruned and it looked like he had been in the water for a long time. His clothes were soaked. His eyes were bloodshot. But then they noticed something weird. His hair was dry and it was neatly combed. And that didn't make sense. How could he have come out of the Mississippi with his hair untouched? So the story was unbelievable, as in they actually didn't believe it. So at this point, it was too dark to venture back out onto the bridge. So they brought Tom back to the station where they had him go over his story a few more times. And then in the morning, when it was daybreak, they actually filmed a recorded video as a reenactment where you can see Tom with a coffee in hand right next to Sergeant Nichols, showing him where it happened, where he said the girls were attacked. And then he showed him the open manhole where he said he was forced to drop down and where Julie and Robin were pushed. Now, though the story still seemed very far-fetched, at least they had Tom's statement. They had the location, but they didn't have Julie and they didn't have Robin. Not yet. The Mississippi River is wide and it's unforgiving, and the girls were out there somewhere and they were lost. And soon, officers showed up at Tom's grandpa's house that morning, and they told his family that there had been an incident involving Tom, Julie, and Robin. The word incident really stood out, especially to 16-year-old Janine. The cop didn't say accident. He used the word incident. But then he wouldn't elaborate any further, and he wouldn't let them know if their loved ones were safe and where they were. But they were involved in an incident, and it involved the Chain of Rocks Bridge. And then news got to Julie and Robin's mom, Ginny, and the family made their way out to the scene shortly afterward, hoping that somehow the girls were still alive. But no one knew that this was just the beginning of their nightmare. But before their names were etched into the pages of one of St. Louis's most horrifying crimes, Julie and Robin Carey were known for their compassion, their creativity, and a rare kind of emotional depth that touched everyone who knew them. They were not just sisters. They were best friends. They were intellectual. They were advocates for change in a world that didn't always seem ready for change. It was the early 90s, and a shift was starting to happen in our society. The girls were born to Richard and Virginia Carey. Julie came into the world on December 16th of 1970, followed by Robin on January 27th of 1972. They were raised in a modest ranch-style home on Petit Drive in Spanish Lake, a quiet suburb in North St. Louis County, Missouri. The Carey home was full of warmth, imagination, and a deep sense of family. The girls were 2 of 3 sisters, with their youngest sister Jamie completing the family. Their early years were spent attending St. Jerome's Elementary School, where their teachers quickly noted their intelligence and quiet kindness. Later, they both moved on to Hazelwood East High School, where they continued to excel academically. They weren't the loudest in the room, but they left an impression on everyone. Both girls made the honor roll consistently, with their teachers often calling them dream students. Julie, the oldest, had a natural confidence about her. She was barely 5 feet tall and just over 100 pounds, with a head full of auburn curls that swept her shoulders. She had bright green eyes and a friendly smile. When she enrolled at the University of Missouri in St. Louis in the fall of 1989, she majored in English and was quickly recognized as a standout in her department. Her English professor would later call her the most promising poet he ever taught. And that wasn't hyperbole. Julie had already published 2 poems in the university's literary magazine. They were raw, vivid, and they were full of meaning. One of these poems was called A Poet's Love Song, and this is what it read in part, quote, "Amidst the early morning lovers, beneath a newborn sun, we sat on park benches in the dark. We, whose dormant hearts suffered the cold, surviving on tired manuscripts and dog-eared love letters, we saw it coming. We used to wait for it in cozy cafes and prophesize with our pens on paper napkins, color it with chalk on city sidewalks." End quote. Julie's words would just come alive on the page. She was honest, observant, and not afraid to feel deeply. In her second published piece called Undertow, she described the experience of being trapped in a rushing current. It read in part, "Picture yourself, 1,000 tiny pebbles rushing downstream in the current that presses your skin against huge jagged rocks. As frightening as you are frightened, remember that the undertow can take you in so easily." Now, those lines would later haunt her loved ones. It was like a prophecy. Now, Robin was a year behind her sister, and she joined University of Minnesota in St. Louis in 1990. Now, she pursued French and German with the goal of becoming a translator, and like Julie, she had a gift with words. She was quiet and more reserved than her big sister, but she expressed herself powerfully through poetry and visual art. Robin was known for a striking sense of style. She loved vintage clothing, she often wore black, and embraced her individuality. She was about the same size as her older sister, petite with blue eyes and straight, shiny brown hair that barely came up to her chin, but she wore it in a heavy part to one side, except for one small, skinny braid of hair that she never cut, and it draped over her right ear and hung down her back, almost to her waist. It was very unique, and it definitely made her stand out. It was a piece of her past that she held on to. She was also a vegetarian, which reflected her commitment to living consciously. Her humor was dry, often sarcastic, and it definitely caught people off guard from time to time. She had a way of delivering one-liners that would leave you laughing, but also kind of questioning what she meant by that, because she had a little bit of dry humor. But she rarely sought the spotlight, and the bond between the Carey sisters was one that could never be broken. Even if they did have their occasional arguments as sisters, they were truly best friends. They loved spending time together. They loved listening to Sinead O'Connor, watching the Dead Poets Society, or dreaming about how they were going to change the world, and they believed they could. The message from the film that they loved so much, Carpe Diem, seize the day, was a mantra that they actually took to heart. Their bedroom walls were decorated with peace signs, handwritten quotes, and calls for social justice. One of the quotes read, "Who said you can't change the world?" And this wasn't just decoration. It was a belief that they held to firmly. Julie once marched in Washington, D.C. to protest for individuals without homes who were living on the streets. When her friends asked what she would do if she ever won the lottery, she answered without even hesitating that she would open an apartment building for people that were unhoused. She would help them get job training, and it would be a place where they could heal. And despite her only having a part-time job and very limited income, Julie and Robin both donated to Amnesty International and Greenpeace. They volunteered at the Salvation Army Family Haven. They would tutor first graders in downtown St. Louis. And they didn't just talk about helping, they actually helped. And in 1987, their world shifted because their parents got divorced. Ginny had been a stay-at-home mom for nearly 2 decades, and she had to return to work. The family struggled financially, but they remained strong. Robin, she was so thoughtful. that she even gave her mom a teddy bear one Christmas that year, but it wasn't just a teddy bear. Attached to the bear was a handwritten note promising that she would pay 2 of her mom's bills. Any choice, she could pick the 2, and then she gave her the $300 that she had saved, and this gesture was something that Ginny would never forget. Julie was a leader. She was a planner, and Robin was beside her, helping her every step of the way. And together, they even adopted or sponsored a family in need. They call it adopting a family for Christmas, and they raised $600 and delivered 5 carloads of gifts. Even though their mom said, you might not have enough money for anything for yourselves this Christmas, and they didn't care. They believed in doing the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. And I was thinking how far $600 used to go in 1991. 5 carloads of gifts. That's a lot. In 1989, on a warm summer night, Julie and Robin painted that message in black and white across the concrete pavement of the Chain of Rocks Bridge. It wasn't far from their home, and their message stretched 20 yards. It was a poetic protest against racial division, and I told you it read, "United we stand, divided we fall." It's not a black or white thing. We in a new generation take a stand. This bridge became a place of reflection for them. It was a very peaceful place. Other people might have seen it as just like abandoned concrete and graffiti, but they saw beauty and hope. And on April 4th of 1991, Julie and Robin were 2 young women with a lot of dreams and passions, and they really wanted to show their cousin this beautiful message that they put on that bridge. They had no way of knowing that this bridge, where they left this beautiful message of unity, would soon become the place where they spent their last moments. Now, this bridge stretched across the Mississippi from Missouri into Illinois, with entrances on both sides. It was like a relic frozen in time, a 5,353-foot-long steel ribbon arching across the water. It was rusting with age and haunting in its symmetry. The Chain of Rocks Bridge, this was a landmark of Americana. It was once a vital part of Route 66, the Mother Road. It carried dreamers west. It was built in the 1920s, and it used to be busy and full of life. But by 1970, the bridge had closed to cars and traffic, and what remained was a skeletal corridor of concrete suspended 60 feet above the swirling and unforgiving river. And over the years, nature reclaimed it with moss crawling up its sides, rusted railings, and even birds making their nests beneath its beams, and vines creeping across its weathered steel. The bridge developed a mystique about it. And in 1980, it was actually featured in the movie Escape from New York. And at that point, it had gotten a little sketchy. It was really worn down, but it had such a beautiful view that people would often climb the fences that were supposed to keep people out just to catch a glimpse, 6 stories high, looking out as far as the eye could see. To many people, it became a spot for adventure. Local teens would go there because they were drawn by the thrill of its isolation. Some teens would come to skateboard on it. Others came to party, and some would even spray paint rebellious slogans or their initials. And yet, the Chain of Rocks Bridge had a different meaning for Julie and Robin. They didn't see danger. They really saw beauty and poetry. To the Carey sisters, this bridge was sacred ground. It was part urban cathedral and part open-air journal for them. It was here on a summer night in 1989 that they returned with paint and a vision. Using black and white as their palette, they wrote out those words, a declaration. Robin once said that the bridge just made her feel calm, and Julie used to bring friends just to sit and talk and just kind of like get away from the world for a minute. Sometimes they would lay down and they would look up at the stars, and they would listen to the water below. But if you're wondering where the name came from, the Chain of Rocks Bridge, it came from a natural rock formation that was below. It was treacherous for steamboats back in the day. These rocks were nearly invisible, and more than one vessel had run into the ground near the bridge. The rocks were a hazard. It was considered one of the most dangerous spots, and they're still there. Today, they jet out above the surface, causing a swirling, churning effect as the current rushes past. And I talked about its symmetry, how it was kind of haunting. Well, it wasn't a straight bridge like you would imagine one. It made a sudden 22-degree bend in the middle, and this was an engineering solution to river traffic, but also a very unsettling feature for anyone unfamiliar with the layout in the dark. It was actually very disorienting for someone that didn't know it bent like that. By 1991, when this case took place, the bridge had become a hangout for groups looking for a place to just get away or even get into trouble. It was closed to cars, and it was accessible on foot or bike, and it offered a panoramic view of the Mississippi River and the St. Louis skyline. People also really like to look at the little water intake towers. They look like little castles in the middle of the water. But this bridge wasn't exactly safe. There were open manholes that I told you I would tell you about because that sounds kind of weird on a bridge, but this is where workers used to gain access to the underpinnings, and these manholes were scattered about every 100 feet or so. And they were open. There were no covers on them anymore because this bridge wasn't in working order. So if you didn't know the pathway, you could easily fall inside there. And there were no working streetlights at the time. So you were in pitch black at night, except for the stars and maybe the lights on shore. I know that was very detailed, but I really needed to paint a picture of what this bridge was like. I tried to get so many photos that I could find if you're watching, so it'll give you an idea of what happened and what it looked like that night. But on the night of April 4th, it was quiet. It was a cool night. The stars were visible in the sky. And for Julie and Robin, it felt like the perfect way to say goodbye to their cousin. Tom and Julie were really close. They shared a special bond. They had spent a summer together at their grandmother's house in Florida, and they became really close. Bonded not just by family, but a shared emotional sensitivity that they had. Julie wanted to take Tom somewhere meaningful, somewhere that spoke to who she and Robin were, and she wanted to show him her poem. So the three of them, Julie, Robin, and Tom, slipped quietly out of their homes late at night, and it wasn't the first time they had done this together. And to them, this was innocent. A short walk, a moment of peace on this bridge, but for all its symbolism and comfort, it could not protect them for what was to come. They reached it at about 11:30, and they were walking beneath the chain link fence and into the overgrown brush before stepping onto the concrete. And about 5 minutes walking in the dark on the bridge, where they used lighters to light their path, they saw the peace sign and they knew where they were. Their poem was there, bold, defiant, and they're proud to show it off in the dark. The three cousins stood there near the Illinois side of the bridge, admiring their message in the dark. And Tom kept watching as his cousins were just so confidently moving around this bridge, but he was uneasy because of those open manholes. They were hazards that he hadn't expected being there, but they just didn't seem afraid. This was a place they knew very well. They were actually kind of like making fun of him and saying like, don't worry, come on, what are you doing? Why are you being a chicken? But let's switch back to Tom and the police. Because when he was at the police station, he was being questioned again and again because they wanted to understand every little detail of what happened that night. Me too. That's why I try to paint you the best picture I can. There were many versions to Tom's story, what happened, but they all kind of contained the same information, except just minor deviations. But from everything that he said, this is what happened. They were admiring the poem, and they heard footsteps in the dark coming towards them from the Missouri side. 4 men approached them. They were walking casually, and they appeared to be friendly, and they greeted the cousins. They asked them how they were doing, just small talk. And then they stopped to smoke a cigarette. And then one of the guys flung himself over the side of the railing, which frightened everyone at first, but then he was just standing up on a steel platform beside the bridge. And it led underneath to where one of those manholes led up underneath the bridge pavement. So what he did is he climbed over and then he went underneath and then he popped his head up through the manhole and kind of made a joke saying this was a good place to be alone with your woman. And that was it. Just a few words that the men exchanged, and then they just continued walking. And the cousins were relaxed, and they just assumed that this encounter was over, but it wasn't. Because moments later, as the cousins were looking out over the water, the same group of men turned back around and walked towards them again. And this was the point when one of them claimed he lost his flashlight and asked them, if you see it, let me know. And then came just small talk and laughter. And for a moment, everything felt okay until it wasn't. Because without warning, the men just shifted their tone. And then their presence became really aggressive. One of them grabbed Tom and he told them this is a robbery. And if they did what he said, everything would be okay. Then they forced him to lay face down on the bridge and they said, don't look up. If you look up, I will kill you. And Tom froze. His face was pressed against the concrete. And this guy's boot was on the back of his neck. And behind him, Julie and Robin were separated from him, and they were being led further and further down the bridge by the 3 other men. Tom could hear them. He couldn't see them, but he could hear his cousins' voices. They were trembling with fear, and then they were crying, and then they were screaming. And what followed was honestly what nightmares are made of, because according to Tom's statement, the men forced themselves on the girls one after the other, each man taking turns while one of them held Tom down and threatened him, making sure that he was not able to help. One of them said they had a gun. Another promised to throw one of the girls over the bridge if she didn't stop screaming. Tom, lying prone, unable to move, could do nothing but just listen. He was then robbed. They took his wallet and his Swatch watch. When the attackers found out he was a firefighter or they saw his badge, they kind of panicked, thinking that he was a cop. And that's when they said, "We know where you live, and if you say anything, we will find you." And then came the next phase of this nightmare. One of the guys came over back to Tom and said, "I just fucked your girl. How does that make you feel?" And he was like, "They're my cousins." And the guy was like, "Oh, y'all are cousins. Okay." Kind of like he didn't believe him. Like Tom was trying to minimize it and the guy wasn't really taking it as him being serious. And then Tom was forced to walk to this painted hopscotch, and it was really eerie because it literally led to an open manhole. That was the last step on the hopscotch. And he was ordered to climb down to the steel platform below the bridge. And once he was there, he found Julie unclothed except for a green flannel, and Robin didn't have any clothes on, and they were visibly shaken, lying on their backs with their eyes closed. And you could faintly make out something Julie was saying. She was trying to comfort her sister, saying things like, "It'll be over soon. Don't worry. Everything's going to be okay." But if only that were the truth. When Tom got down there, the girls got up and they all huddled together, and he was trying to comfort them. But there was no time because two of the attackers jumped down there. And then in an instant, it would shatter their lives forever because Julie was pushed. And without warning, without even a word, one of the men reached out and just shoved her from the platform, and she screamed as she fell into that river. And then Robin screamed too. She kind of lunged forward, almost to fight or even to grab a hold of her sister. But when she did, she was pushed, and both of these girls were gone in just seconds. And then these men turned to Tom and they were like, "Jump or get shot." And he was terrified, so he just jumped. And he remembers falling so far. He said it took forever to hit the water, like he was just floating in slow motion. And once he broke the surface, it was with such force, it was so intense, the water was so cold, and it was fast and relentless, and he had to kick really hard to get his head above the water. And when he finally surfaced, he obviously had to get his bearings straight because he didn't know where he was, and he realized the water was pushing him away from the Missouri side, and he was struggling to even get out of his coat because he was still wearing his clothes. And he was trying to keep his head above the water, but there were logs and floating debris all around him. It was just going past at a fast pace. And after he was able to kind of calm down from the initial shock, he was scanning the surface looking for his cousins. And that's when he finally spotted Julie. She was by one of the intake towers about 15 feet away from him, and he yelled to her, and she screamed, "Oh my God, where's Robin?" And he just yelled back, "We have to swim." He told her to swim towards the lights on shore. And I can't even begin to imagine being in that river at night. It's so huge, it's wide. And Julie yelled back that she was drowning. But Tom, he tried to reassure her that she wasn't going to drown, just keep swimming, swim towards him. And she tried. And finally, he could see that she was right behind him. And that's when I told you she grabbed on him. He could see her exhaustion, and the current was so strong that they both went under together. Tom did not have a second to take in a breath before he was pushed under, so now he was drowning. And he took Julie and he thrusted her towards the surface, and then he kicked as hard as he could to break up to the top again. And then he yelled to swim and keep swimming. But the current was way too strong to keep them together. They were both just trying to make it to shore. Tom swam towards the Missouri bank and he was disoriented and he was barely surviving. So he turned back from time to time just to make sure that Julie was there, but soon he couldn't see her anymore. And that's when he started to talk really negatively to himself. He was saying things like, "I can't do this, I can't do this," but he knew he had to. So he began to do the backstroke to save energy, but anytime he stopped kicking, the current would just take him. But finally, he managed to get to shore. His clothes were waterlogged, his body was sore from the fall and the river's pull, but he climbed onto the shore near the chain of rocks waterworks building. But the bank was 6 feet high. It was full of really slimy, slippery logs and driftwood, plus a lot of soft mud. And after all of the energy he had just exerted, this was yet another challenge. It took him a few tries before he made it to the top. And that's when he saw the road. And you know the rest. The police took his statement, and at first, what they heard, it was horrifying. They could see his hands were pruned, his jeans were streaked with river mud, his shirt was damp and it was clinging to his body. But I told you, his hair was dry. It was neatly parted, and that stuck with the detectives. I was thinking, he was already out of the water. He was climbing up that bank. He was standing on the road for an hour before the detectives even questioned him. So, I saw him in the video, in the back of an ambulance. And yes, he appeared to be dry in a paramedic's jacket on, but that doesn't mean that this didn't happen just because his short hair wasn't wet. But it's what the officers didn't see that made them question his story. No visible injuries. Tom claimed he had jumped nearly 60 feet into the river. The newspaper I read actually said 90 feet. Yet he didn't appear to have any bruises or scrapes. Nothing. No broken bones. So officers began to question the physics of that fall. How could you survive? Then there was a detective from the Missouri State Water Patrol, and he mentioned the river currents and the conditions outside that night. This was information that raised even more suspicions because they wondered if it was possible to swim to shore from the location that Tom described. And another officer was quietly saying this out loud. He said, if this man had just experienced a near-death escape and the violent murders of his cousins, why didn't he fight back? Well, he did say that one of these 4 men, there were 4 men, there was one of him and 4 of them, and they said they had a gun. But when asked if he saw it, he never did. It was never pressed onto his head or his body. So if he was a firefighter, someone with authority, I guess they figured, why didn't you do anything? Why didn't you even try? So they wanted to dig a little deeper. And by 9 o'clock that morning, Tom was taken to the station to provide a formal recorded statement. He had been up all night. He was visibly shaken and he was emotionally exhausted. Yet the interview continued for hours upon hours. These officers began pressing him harder and harder. Was he telling the truth? Well, his own father apparently didn't think so, or at least it seemed that way, because he made a really odd gesture. And I'm sure you remember this because in the 90s, it was really popular. It was that gesture where you take one of your fingers and you kind of make a circular motion like someone's crazy. Well, that is what Gene Cummins did behind his son's back when officers were questioning him at the scene, insinuating that he didn't believe what his son was saying. Adding to the confusion was the alleged inconsistencies in Tom's story. Police said that at some point during the interview, Tom told them he never jumped off the bridge at all. He ran off the bridge once he saw his cousins being attacked. And then when he reached the riverbank, he entered the water only up to about his neck to try to save them. But he couldn't because the current was too strong. And according to the first responders and the authorities, he revised his story when pressure was put on him, when they questioned the lack of injuries, and he even failed a polygraph test. Now, he had been awake for, I think, 30 hours at the point, so sleep deprivation can cause your body to register as deceptive on a lie detector test because they're using cues from your body, your heart rate, your breathing. He was exhausted. That is when Tom's father was brought into the room around 1 p.m., and officers said that he encouraged his son to tell the truth. And it was then that police claimed that Tom made a really interesting admission, that he had feelings for his cousin Julie. They had grown close during the summer in Florida, and on that bridge, he made an inappropriate advance towards her. And well, there was some evidence that kind of backed this up. There was a card taken from his grandpa's house that Julie had given him back on April 1st. It was a poem that was written by Nikki Giovanni, and it read, quote, "We're not lovers because of the love we make, but the love we have. We're not friends because of the laughs we spend, but the tears we save. I don't want to be near you for the thoughts we share, but the words we never have to speak. I will never miss you because of what we do, but what we are together." End quote. And inside, Julie wrote, "Tom, I love you. Don't ever forget that. No matter where you are or how much time passes between us, I couldn't forget you in a million years. Remember me. kisses, and revolution. Jules. Okay, so I have to admit, that's a little interesting. And there's more. In a recorded interview, it became obvious that Tom did have really deep feelings for his cousin Julie. But don't take my word for it. You can listen to him explain it.
Have been very, very close since we were on vacation in Florida last year. We did have, I feel, a real strong bond between us. We definitely fell for each other real quick. I mean, that was it. We both laid down the ground rules right away. I had a girlfriend and she had a boyfriend.
The way he talked about her did seem more romantic than a family member or a friendship. He literally said they fell for each other real quick, but that was it. In his words, he explained to the officers that they laid down the ground rules right away. And I was thinking, right, because y'all are cousins. But instead, his rationale was he had a girlfriend and she had a boyfriend. So I was like, wait a minute, the cousin thing wasn't an obstacle? I think that would definitely raise a red flag for an investigator. I'm just saying. So the police told him they knew what happened. They said that Julie rejected him, they got in an argument, and somehow, whether during a scuffle or some kind of outburst, she fell. Well, when he was pressed in this way, Tom allegedly claimed that he blacked out and he couldn't remember what happened. The police filled in all the details. They said maybe Robin jumped in after her, or maybe you pushed her too. But that version, the police's version, was never recorded, and that's convenient, isn't it? Why wouldn't you record that if it was true? And later, Tom would deny ever saying those things. I mean, you heard some of them. He definitely said that. But I mean, the part about, him making an advance at her and her falling off the bridge, he never said that. He said he was manipulated and he was overwhelmed. He told them, if that's what you want to believe, so be it. And officers interpreted that as a confession that he was responsible for all of this. Even though they had no physical evidence linking Tom to any violence on the bridge, no blood, no weapons, no motive, the police arrested him on suspicion of murdering his own cousins. This story, of course, made headlines, and the family was in total shock. But within 24 hours, the St. Louis Circuit Attorney's Office reviewed the evidence and they made a different decision. There was just not enough to charge him with a crime. The girls were missing. There was no proof that they were dead, and Tom Cummins was released. The police shifted their focus now, because while investigators combed the bridge for clues, a series of discoveries unfolded. On the bridge deck, detectives recovered a used condom, a pen, coins, and a cigarette butt. But one item stood out, a black flashlight with the inscription Horn 1 etched onto its side. Now, it wasn't near the rest of the evidence. It was found several yards away, almost as though it had been tossed there. And remember what Tom said. He mentioned one of the men asked them if anyone had seen a flashlight. Well, this seemed like a lead. The flashlight was then sent to the media where they put it on TV and they told anyone out there with information to come forward. Well, within an hour, police get a phone call from a woman who recognized the flashlight. It belonged to her husband. But she said, I think it was stolen by one of my son's friends. And his name was Antonio Richardson. And now, Tom's account, which was dismissed just days earlier, was starting to look a lot different. He described 4 men, the direction they came from, and the conversation about a flashlight. So it all started to match up. And on April 6th, just one day after Tom was released, police found and brought in 16-year-old Antonio Richardson for questioning. He was a high school dropout with a troubled background and substance addiction. When Antonio sat across from the officers, his body language was withdrawn and he wouldn't even make eye contact. But then, shockingly, he just confessed. He admitted that he was on the bridge that night, and he admitted to the attack, and even to being part of what happened to Julie and Robin, that he forced himself on one of them at least, and he identified the flashlight as the one he brought there. He went to the bridge with police, and he described the events that mirrored Tom's original account: the ambush, the threats, the open manholes, and the screams. Antonio claimed that he didn't want to be involved. He was pressured and afraid, and he named the one person he said orchestrated everything: 23-year-old Marlon Gray. Now, this man had a very commanding presence and a history of violence. According to Antonio, Marlon was the ringleader, the one who encouraged the attack and then threatened the others into silence. He said Marlon warned him, if you talk, I'll find out and I will kill you. So this interview was recorded and I have a part of it, so let me play it for you now.
I think he was really saying that if whoever didn't cooperate with him, something bad was going to happen to them.
Did Marlon ever tell you all that everyone was going to have to take the girls?
Yes, and also told us if we got caught or the police came to us, if we was to tell on him, when he get through doing with the police, he was going to hurt us bad.
Antonio also implicated 19-year-old Reginald Clemens. He was known in the area, and police would later note he was visibly nervous when he was questioned. His interview began as expected. He was quiet, he was defensive, and he was reluctant to share any details. But as the detectives mentioned Julie and Robin Carey, Reginald's composure began to crack. He started to break down and cry, and eventually he admitted that he was on that bridge. He confirmed that the group encountered 2 white girls and a white guy, and he said the interaction started out friendly, just some small talk. This is exactly what Tom said, and what Antonio had mentioned. But then he revealed what came next, the idea to rob the guy and have their way with the girls. Reginald said that Antonio was the one that suggested the attack, and that he too participated in having his way with the girls. Reginald also admitted to robbing Tom and said that he was one of the men that was standing on the platform below the bridge with the others. According to him, the girls fought back really hard. They screamed, they clawed, and when one was attacked, the other one tried to help. Reginald denied pushing anyone into the river, but he said that Antonio wanted to eliminate witnesses. So let's play part of his interview.
We was towing the whip and he pushed the first girl from behind. She fell off. He tried to push the other one. She grabbed and he hit her and she fell. And he told the guy to jump or he was going to get shot. And the guy jumped. Yes.
Reginald said that Antonio was the one that pushed the girls. And now it seemed like Antonio, who was so forthcoming right away, may have had way more to do with this crime. And maybe that's why he was so quick to talk and to implicate others. Well, they finally tracked down 23-year-old Marlon Gray at a friend's house. They brought him in for questioning, and he was tall. He was 6'4", over 200 pounds, and he had a reputation. But he didn't really come off as aggressive at first. He actually confessed right away to forcing himself on both Robin and Julie. But he said that afterward, he left the bridge and walked back to his car, distancing himself from the final moments. He denied having any involvement in the murders, and according to him, by the time he learned that the girls had been pushed, they had already left the bridge. However, he did admit he was the leader of their group. Now, recall that Tom said the taller one seemed to be the leader. Well, it was his job to subdue Tom. Here's part of what he told police.
They put up a small fight, but they realized it would be in their best interest not to fight.
After you took the clothes off of Julie, what happened then?
Yes.
And you forced her to have sex. You raped her. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, what did you do after you had sex with Julie?
I went over to Robin and proceeded to do the same thing.
Marlon said he left right after he was done with the girls, and he had no idea they were pushed until later. He also provided detectives with the name of the 4th guy, Daniel Winfrey, only 15 years old. He was the youngest of the group and the last to be brought in. Now, his account echoed what the others said. He admitted he was on the bridge. He admitted to restraining one of the girls, and he admitted the idea to commit the attack came from Marlon, who Daniel claimed said he was in the mood to hurt someone after he saw the girls walking with Tom on that bridge. Daniel told the police that it was Marlon who actually distributed condoms and was trying to push the guys into action. Daniel insisted that he didn't do anything with either one of the girls and he did not push them either. But he described in detail how Antonio and Reginald brought Julie and Robin to the open manhole with the intention of throwing them into the water. It was clear now. There were 4 men, 4 confessions, and every single one of them supported what Tom said from the very beginning. And each one of them was a link in a chain that was now leading directly to the chain of Roxbridge and to the murder of 2 beautiful, extraordinary young women. And this case was no longer about Tom Cummins. It was about something much deeper. And this was no longer a missing persons case. It was a rescue mission because they didn't think these women survived. The case was cracked open with a phone call triggered by a flashlight. And Tom, who had been arrested and publicly labeled a suspect at first, was now vindicated. And that's because The police not only got the confessions from these other men, but they found the stolen watch. It was Tom's. They were searching a home that Marlon had recently visited, and they found it there. And that was the final link. Tom had already returned to Washington, D.C., but when he was called back, he came down willingly. And in a lineup, he identified each one of the 4 men. By Monday, April 8th, just 4 days after the attack, all 4 suspects were in custody and charged with the murders of Julie and Robin Carey, who were sadly presumed dead. For their mother, Ginny, the details were unbearable to hear about. When investigators told her that her daughters actually fought back, she nodded through her tears because she wasn't surprised. Julie and Robin were fighters. Even Robin, the quieter one of the two, wouldn't have given up without a fight. Ginny knew her daughters so well, and she believed that one thing was certain: they would have defended one another until the very end. And for 21 days, the Mississippi River kept its secrets as rescue teams scanned the depths with sonar, searched the banks with canines, and went through the water in painstaking efforts to bring Julie and Robin home. Ginny never stopped hoping, but with every day that passed, that hope became harder to hold on to. They hoped that just like Tom made it to shore, that the girls did too. Maybe a long way down, maybe in a neighboring town, or maybe even further. Perhaps they were living off nature and they would have this great story to tell of survival. But Ginny was also worried because she knew that Julie had recently injured her knee playing soccer. She feared that injury would make it impossible for Julie to stay afloat in that current. But even more than her physical fears, there was something far deeper that was just gnawing at her day in and day out, and that was the silence. It was the emptiness, it was the space where her daughters once were. And just one night, imagine that 2 of her daughters were gone. You go from them laughing and carrying on at home and their voices vibrant and filling the house to just quiet. And then came April 26th of 1991. A fisherman in Caruthersville, roughly 200 miles south of St. Louis, spotted something unusual floating among the driftwood as he was fishing in a slough. As he got closer, his stomach dropped. What he had found was the decomposed body of a young woman. He, of course, called the authorities. The body was pulled from the water, and it was taken for an examination. In the medical examiner's office, they used dental records to confirm what the Carey family feared so much. It was Julie Ann Carey. Ginny had dreaded this moment, but she knew that it could happen. But the reality of it shattered her. She had always assumed her daughters would be found together, that whatever happened, they would have stayed side by side. But only Julie had come home. And there was no trace of Robin anywhere. Not a scrap of clothing, not a piece of evidence, nothing. But the family was holding out hope. But eventually, it was time to face what they already knew in their hearts. Robin was gone too. Where she was, they would never know. Till this day, sadly, her body has never been found. The Mississippi River is the 4th largest river in the world. It snakes on the border of Missouri and Illinois, and then it winds down to meet the Ohio River, and then it cuts between Missouri and Kentucky, then Tennessee, and breaks away from Missouri and borders Tennessee and Arkansas, and then branches off at the southernmost point in Louisiana and pours into the Gulf of, well, now it's called Gulf of America on Google Maps, and from there into the vast oceans of the North Atlantic and the South Pacific. It was a miracle that Julie's body was ever found. The current is strong and it would quickly be carried downstream. Remember that Julie was 200 miles away. The temperature, the microorganisms, they further contribute to faster decomposition. So scientifically speaking, it could essentially disintegrate or sink to the depths that we cannot even reach, where marine life would take over. I know it's sad and it's heartbreaking, but it is the truth. And it has been over 30 years now. But I want to go back to 1991. With 4 men now in custody and their confessions recorded, the case was progressing quickly. But for the Carey family, the legal victories felt really empty. They had lost 2 beautiful loved ones, daughters, sisters. They were so special to so many people, and to honor them, the University of Missouri in St. Louis established the Julie and Robin Carey Memorial Scholarship. It was a tribute not only to their academic excellence, but to their spirit. The scholarship would be awarded to students who, like Julie and Robin, were brilliant and compassionate, students that held part-time jobs to support themselves while pursuing degrees. And then on May 20th of 1991, about 3 weeks after Julie's body was found, a funeral and memorial service was held at St. Jerome's Catholic Church, where Julie and Robin had once attended school. The church overflowed. Friends, professors, classmates, neighbors, even people that didn't even know them, filled the pews in silence. They were struggling to reconcile the loss of these two young women that were so full of light and purpose. The pastor delivered these words: "Maybe the world wasn't ready for them. They were too special, too good for this place." And at the service, the music that they played was composed by Julie on an electric keyboard, and it played softly through the entire sanctuary. It was like a final goodbye that she had written herself. And even though only one of the Carey sisters were physically laid to rest at Calvary Cemetery, both of their names were etched on the gravestone. And as loved ones gathered around their graves, a simple but powerful act of remembrance took place. They blew bubbles into the air, something that we've all probably done as children with childlike innocence, and it was something the girls were known to do, even into adulthood. And now it was a send-off, floating and rising and shimmering in the sunlight. It was a tribute that reflected who they were. They were bright, fleeting, and beautiful. Ginny stood by the gravesite filled with grief, but she was supported by so many people. The funeral wasn't the end, though. It was the beginning of a very long, painful journey through trials, appeals, controversy, and of course, media scrutiny. But in that moment, on that day, Julie and Robin were remembered, not for the violence they endured, but for the grace, intellect, and kindness they gave to this world. I want to recap who the four perpetrators are. The group was made up of Antonio Richardson, who's 16 years old, Marlon Gray, who's 23, Reginald Clemens, who's 19, and Daniel Winfrey, who is just 15. Each boy had a different background, a different motivation, and varying levels of involvement, but all four were there that night, and all four had a role that they played, and all four were now facing a first-degree murder charge. Antonio Richardson was the first to confess, and he's the one that admitted he was there. He participated in the indecent things done to at least one of the girls at his hands. He was carrying the flashlight, and he also pointed to Marlon Gray as the one who instigated the violence. Now, Antonio also claimed that Marlon told them to rob and hurt the girls and the group. He said that Marlon pressured him and the others, using his size and his presence to keep them in line. And he said that before Marlon left the bridge, and after he did what he did to the girls, they discussed the plan to eliminate witnesses. And ultimately, he carried out that plan by pushing Julie and Robin into the Mississippi River. But Antonio said that he jumped in too, and he made it to shore. But I was like, another person saying they jumped in? It was interesting. And then there was Reginald Clemens. He kind of echoed what Antonio said. He said he was on the bridge and that he robbed Tom and he forced himself on one of the girls. And he also described how the girls fought back and they screamed and they resisted. And he denied ever pushing any of them into the water. He said Antonio did that because he wanted to silence them. Now later, Reginald's lawyers would actually claim that his entire confession was coerced because he was being beaten by cops. His mother came forward later and testified that she saw bruises on his face, but photographs were taken after booking and they didn't show any visible injuries. So then there's 23-year-old Marlon Gray, who we've heard a lot about because everyone's saying he's the ringleader, right? Marlon's confession was the most contradictory. He admitted to doing things to both girls, but he said he left the bridge afterwards and he walked to his car. He claimed he had no involvement in the murders, no knowledge that the girls were even pushed until afterward. But that's not what other people said, especially Daniel Winfrey. He's the 15-year-old. He was the one that described him as the ringleader. He said Marlon told him to hold down the girls and even suggested pushing them into the river to eliminate witnesses. But Marlon denied ever giving such orders. When he was arrested, he too claimed that his entire confession was under duress. Here's part of that interview.
They beat me. And the whole time that they beat me, they were telling me that I was guilty of murder. And at one point, they stood me up against the wall and was punching me in my stomach and chest. At one point, they put their hands around my neck. They're choking me.
And last, let's just go over Daniel Winfrey one more time. He was the youngest and probably the most complicated in the group. He confessed to being on the bridge, holding down one of the girls, and being present when they were pushed, but he said he wasn't down the manhole, he was on top of the bridge. And he said he didn't engage in anything with them, and he didn't do anything beyond watching them go over. Because of his age, though, and his lesser role, as far as they were concerned from his confession, prosecutors saw value in cutting a deal with him. In exchange for his testimony against Marlon, Reginald, and Antonio, Daniel could plead guilty to second-degree murder, SA, and robbery, and he would receive a 30-year sentence. This would mean he would avoid life in prison or the death penalty. Daniel's cooperation became the cornerstone of the state's case. The physical evidence continued to support the confessions. On the bridge I told you, they found a used condom, which later was tested and revealed Marlon Gray's DNA. The stolen watch was recovered from a house that Marlon had visited, and the engraved flashlight tying Antonio directly to the scene. Some may say that these cases are cut and dry, but to me, they're complicated. You can't really take anyone's word for it. There's no other witnesses besides these guys that are in a group and all know each other. But then I think to myself, well, you were all there. None of you ran to get help. None of you stopped another person from doing it. So it's almost like a conspiracy. And when a conspiracy happens, everyone who planned to go into it is guilty of the same thing. So it would be first-degree murder. But to others, they don't see it that way. They say, no, everybody's different. They all played a different role. It wasn't a conspiracy because they didn't talk about it before. So there's differing viewpoints. And that's why I ask you what you think. Now, for the Carey family, each one of these confessions, each lineup, every piece of evidence was a reminder of the horror that those girls went through. But it was also a step forward. They wanted answers and they wanted justice. And the trials were coming. And with them, a long, emotionally grueling battle would test this family. Don't worry, I'm not going to go extensively into detail of each of these trials because that would take forever. But the first one was Marlon Gray's trial in October of 1992. He was the alleged ringleader, and this was a pivotal moment, not just because of his central role in the attack, but because he had not personally said he pushed Julie or Robin. Prosecutors had to convince the jury that Gray was just as responsible, even if he didn't deliver the final push, ending the girls' lives. He pleaded not guilty to all charges, and his defense team immediately began to undermine the state's narrative. They focused on the methods used during his interrogation, and they claimed that Marlon had been beaten and that he'd been thrown to the floor and his confession had been coerced. He had an injured knee, and that made him very vulnerable. But the prosecution had something else. They had Daniel Winfrey. And when he took the stand, he laid out in detail a very chilling picture of Marlon's involvement. I think the most important part of his testimony was that he said Marlon looked at the girls and looked at Tom walking, and he said that he felt like hurting someone. And the claim that he handed out condoms and then one of the condoms had his DNA on it really went to corroborating that story as well. But then I was thinking, well, they didn't find any other ones. Maybe the other ones were never used. And it was sad that DNA testing was in its infancy, so we couldn't really get more out of this, like more DNA evidence. And Marlon didn't just sit there. He went against his own attorney's advice and he took the stand in his own defense. And it's something that few defendants do, especially in a capital murder trial. And his testimony was combative. He admitted to the SA, but he would not admit to pushing the girls. The thing that really sealed the deal, though, for the jury, I think, was the fact that the pictures showed there were no injuries on him. After 6 days of testimony and a few short hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict, guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. And 2 days later, Marlon Gray was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Now, Reginald Clemens' trial was next. And like Marlon, he claimed he was coerced into confessing that the police had beaten him during his interrogation, and I told you his mother testified that she saw bruises on his face. But just like in Marlon's case, the state presented photos that were taken just after the interview, and there were no signs of injury. Now, the state heavily relied on testimony from Daniel Winfrey once again, and from Tom, who had identified Reginald in the lineup and recounted how he was the one that robbed him and threatened him up on that bridge. This time, for Reginald's defense, they pointed to Tom's credibility. They pointed out inconsistencies in his statements, and also he reminded the jury that there was no physical evidence directly tying Reginald to the acts of pushing the girls. But the jury wasn't swayed. After 3 hours of deliberation, Reginald Clemens was found guilty and sentenced to death. And this time, Tom testified again, recounting the events with very haunting detail. Prosecutors described Antonio as a very troubled teen who just fell into the wrong crowd, but they emphasized he knew exactly what he was doing. And after 9 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict. But they were deadlocked on his sentence. Some jurors wanted death, and others wanted life without parole. The final decision was left to the judge, And on July 2nd of 1993, Antonio Richardson was sentenced to death by lethal injection. These 3 trials delivered what the Carey family had hoped for: convictions. But closure, not so much, because the girls were still gone and Robin's body was never recovered. And what came next was a new era of legal challenges, the appeals, the clemency hearings, and all kinds of questions about fairness, coercion, and punishments. But for now, justice, even if it was imperfect, it had begun. But as the years passed, the stories grew more complicated. In 2001, nearly a decade after the girls were killed, Antonio Richardson's execution date was set. He was scheduled to die by lethal injection. He was 16 when he was involved in the attack, and now at 26, he was about to face the full consequences of that night. Now, initially, the girl's mother, Jenny, she supported the death sentence. But as the date was set, something shifted. She started to revisit everything, not just the night of the murders, but the legal system, his youth, his background, and even his mental capacity. She came to believe that while Antonio was guilty, he needed to remain in prison and not be executed because that felt wrong to her. She told reporters, "I think Antonio Richardson is responsible for what he did, but I requested clemency for him because of his youth and his diminished mental capacity." Because tests showed Antonio had an IQ of just 70. It's a score that placed him on the borderline for intellectual disabilities. And Ginny said she couldn't live with herself if she didn't speak up. She called the governor and she asked for mercy for Antonio. But her ex-husband, Richard Carey, disagreed. He also called the governor, but he urged him to reject Ginny's plea. So now this case had not just broken apart their city, but also started to break apart their family. And at the 11th hour, the U.S. Supreme Court intervened in this case. Antonio's execution was halted. The court ruled that it was unconstitutional to execute individuals with intellectual disabilities. And in 2002, a second decision, Roper v. Simmons, determined that minors could not be sentenced to death at all. So as a result, Antonio Richardson's sentence was commuted to life without the possibility of parole, and he remains in prison. He continues to maintain his innocence. Now, Marlon Gray's execution was in 2005. While Antonio was spared, Marlon remained on death row because his appeals were denied. His lawyers argued that his confession was coerced and he never pushed the girls, but the state didn't accept that argument. And under Missouri law, anyone who plans, participates in, or facilitates a murder is just as culpable as the person who delivers the fatal blow. Despite the last-minute pleas from death penalty opponents, Marlon Gray was executed by lethal injection on October 26 of 2005 at 12:07 a.m. He declined a final meal, but he did have some final words before the injection. He said, "As I go forward, now on wings built by love and support of my family and friends, I go with peace of mind that comes from never having to take a human life. I forgive those who have hardened their hearts to the truth, and I pray they ask for forgiveness, for they do not know what they do. This is not a death, it's a lynching." Now, as the drugs entered his system, witnesses say that he smiled and he mouthed the words, "I love you," to someone in the crowd. But there is a twist in this story. In 2015, the case against Reginald Clemens began to unravel. For years, his legal team had insisted that his confession was coerced through police brutality. And even though earlier courts had rejected those claims, new evidence and advocacy reopened his case, and a special master was appointed to review the details. There was a bunch of questions about fairness, racial biases, and interrogation practices that resurfaced in this case, and ultimately, his conviction was thrown out. In 2017, after years of legal battles, they reached a plea deal to avoid a retrial. As part of this agreement, Reginald pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and 2 counts of SA and 1 count of first-degree robbery, and he was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms. And at this hearing, he stood in front of the court and he addressed Ginny, who had once watched him receive a death sentence. And this time, he offered something that she had never received before, and that was an apology. He said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carey, for all I have put you through." And Ginny responded outside the courtroom to reporters. She said, "It's been 26 years. I'm glad it's finally over. I'm tired of all the lies." So for Ginny, the apology, it didn't seem to do much because, of course, it wouldn't bring her daughters back. but it did allow her to have some peace. She said, he's on the road to being sorry, and I couldn't even pray for that man before, but now I can. And because of legal technicalities, Reginald became eligible for parole in 2020, but he still remains incarcerated today. Now, Daniel, the first free man who took a deal back in the day, who testified against all of these men, he was paroled in 2007 after only serving a fraction of his sentence. But his freedom was very short-lived because he returned to prison in 2011 and again in 2012 for parole violations. For years after these murders, Tom carried a different kind of trauma. Not only did he witness this attack, he escaped with his life, but he was also identified as the person responsible. He had been falsely arrested, he had been interrogated for hours, and accused of harming his cousins that he tried to save. And eventually he did file a lawsuit against the police, and that settlement was sealed, so I couldn't really see the details, but at least they took accountability. Tom did not go into the spotlight and speak about what happened. It was too hard for him. It was the grief and the shame and the betrayal from the system. But even though Julie and Robin are gone, their voices carry on through their poetry, through their music, through their activism, and through every moment of courage shown by a mother who chose compassion over vengeance. And it's true that some tragedies fade with time, but others leave a really deep mark, and the world can still feel it so many years later. When people do videos walking down this bridge and they put it on YouTube, and I've watched many of them, it brings back not just the story of what happened to Julie and Robin, but it brings back the message that they dared to write and what they stood for. Their mother described them as fighters, a word that she didn't use lightly. She knew what they stood for. She knew they would never have gone without a struggle. And Julie's words as a published poet are forever captured in that literary magazine. And I told you that one of her poems really became haunting for her family, and I would like to read it to you in its entirety. It says, "Picture yourself, 1,000 tiny pebbles rushing downstream in the current that presses your skin against huge, jagged rocks. As frightening as you are frightened, remember that the undertow can take you in so easily. Then imagine that I am the silt, thick and coarse, and not nearly as lovely as the waterfall. Think how I can bury you in my cool, muddy layers beneath all that brings you pain. Imagine how tenderly I can fold my flesh around you." It is beautiful, but it is eerie. But Julie's words weren't the only ones that carried forward. Her cousin Janine, who is 16 at the time that this happened and was also on spring break and lost her 2 cousins that night, she carried the weight of their memory in her own way. In 2004, she published a book called An R.I.P. in Heaven. It was a memoir that told the story of the Chain of Rocks murders from the family's perspective, not just the crime, but the deep injustice they endured when Tom, Janine's brother, was wrongly arrested. I read the book. If you want to, I will link it below in the description box. In writing this book, Janine wanted to reclaim the narrative because everyone wanted to talk about the criminals, but she wanted people to remember her cousins. And that was my focus as well. Julie and Robin were more than just a true crime case. They're more than headlines. They were artists, readers, writers, activists, sisters, and beloved daughters. I hope that you will never forget their story, especially every time you see a bridge or hear about the Mississippi that never let go of Robin. In the years since the murders, the Chain of Rocks Bridge has been repurposed into a pedestrian and bike trail, and it's part of the Regional Greenway project. Families stroll along its now safe path, and tourists take in the sweeping views of the river. But for those that know about the history, the bridge is something more than just a tourist attraction. And somewhere on that concrete, whether it's painted over now or weathered with time, are Julie and Robin's final message. United we stand, divided we fall. It's not a black or white thing. We're a new generation. We take a stand. It wasn't just graffiti to them. It was a mission statement, and it still is. And the lesson we can take from the story isn't about evil. It's about courage. Julie and Robin remind us that even the smallest acts of goodness matter, and we all have a choice. So never underestimate the impact you can have on another person's life. And thank you so much for being here for Julie and Robin's story. I will see you in my next video. Bye.